It's the fact that it's the vicar that makes the whole business so difficult. I simply don't know what to do about it. Those were his very words to me when I taxed him with it after Matins last Sunday. "Well, Miss Burnside," he said, "and what do you propose to do about it?" He smiled at me as he said it, I remember, just a friendly, amused sort of smile over his shoulder as he locked the vestry door, and then he took off his hat in that courteous way of his and walked back to the vicarage, leaving me standing there, without an answer. That was nearly a week ago, and I still don't know what the answer is. And he knows quite well that I don't know. I can see it in his eye whenever we meet. And in a small place like this, it does make for a really impossible situation. MGM from London presents Miss Burnside's Dilemma by Cyril, Hare. My first thought was to go to the police about it. In fact, if it had not been for the chance that my nephew John was staying with me at the time, I think I should have done so. I call it chance, but looking back at it now, I feel that it was rather the hand of Providence. Because if I had obeyed that first impulse, I can see now what a terrible scandal there would have been, and much worse than a mere scandal indeed. It so happened that on Sunday evening, John, he was studying for the bar, and is a very clever boy indeed, was talking to me about a big law case there had been recently, in which a poor woman was made to pay enormous damages for, what did he call it, malicious prosecution. That made me think a great deal of the danger of acting rashly in the matter, and in the end I told him all about it and asked his advice. After all, he is very nearly a lawyer, and as he is not one of the village, it didn't seem to matter. John was tremendously interested, more interested than shocked, I'm afraid, but I suppose that's only natural. And he spent nearly the whole evening considering the matter when he ought to have been studying the law of real property, which is his next examination, and in the end he told me that he could not find that any crime had been committed. Well, that may be the law, and of course I believe what my nephew tells me, but it does seem to me very wrong that the law should permit such things to be done, especially by a minister of the Church of England. Of course, I could write to the bishop about it. Indeed, I have considered very seriously whether it is not my duty to write to the bishop, but it is a step that one shrinks from. In some ways it seems almost more serious than informing the police. I mean, it does seem almost equal to invoking the help of a higher power. I trust I'm not being irreverent in putting it that way, but I do not think the seriousness of it would deter me if I were only sure that the bishop would be able to do anything about it, and of that I cannot be sure. I asked John, but he could not help me. It appears that church law is not one of the subjects they examine him in, which seems a pity. However, he was very kind and helpful in explaining all kinds of points about the law of wills and so on, so that I do at least understand the whole of the dreadful story now quite clearly. Not that that is very much comfort to me indeed, rather the reverse. And situated as I am, there is literally nobody to whom I can turn for guidance. It is just the sort of problem that I could have set before the vicar himself until this terrible thing happened. But now, I want to be perfectly just to the vicar. In all the time that he has been in the village, nobody, I'm sure, has had a word to say against him, except indeed old Judd, and he, I fear, is irreclaimably ill-disposed to every influence for good in the village. Of course, one may say that he, the vicar, I mean, has merely been a hypocrite all these years, and that we've all been woefully deceived in him. But I prefer to think of him as a man suddenly exposed to a great temptation, and being carried away, as might happen to any of us. True, I cannot forget the way in which he brazened it out with me on Sunday, but neither can I believe that I have been utterly mistaken in the man, after knowing him so well for nearly 10 years. That is the time that he has been in the village, and I remember quite well how good an impression he made when Mrs. Wheeler presented him to the living. It was quite soon after Mrs. Wheeler settled down among us and bought the hall, and with it the patronage. Now, I do not myself altogether approve of such a thing as a cure of souls being in the gift of a private person, and I am very glad that Parliament has done something about it, though I can never quite understand what. But it seemed impossible to quarrel with Mrs. Wheeler's choice. and the fact that he was her godson as well as her nephew made it so peculiarly appropriate. Certainly we all agreed that it was a mercy that the old vicar had survived until after Sir John sold the place, for Sir John's intellect was beginning to fail, and what with that and his dangerously low church tendencies, one shudders to think what his choice might have been. Altogether, there is no denying that the double change at the Hall and the vicarage was all to the good of the neighbourhood. Everybody liked Mrs. Wheeler. Even Judd had hardly a word to say against her. True, she lived very quietly, as was after all only proper for a widow who no longer is young. But until last year, when her health began to fail, she took her full part in all the village activities, and whenever help was needed she was unfailingly generous, as indeed she could well afford to be. Not that I consider that detracts in any way from her kindness of heart, but it was common knowledge that Mr. Wheeler, whoever he may have been, had left her very well provided for. The all-important thing was that she used her wealth for the good of others. But if it is true to say that we respected the new vicar and admired Mrs. Wheeler, and I think it is, there is no doubt that we loved Miss Dalrymple. She, I should explain, was Mrs. Wheeler's companion. There is a lot of nonsense talked about the companions of rich old ladies who have no daughters of their own to look after them. They are always represented as poor abject creatures, perpetually bullied and downtrodden by their employers. Miss Dalrymple was not at all like that. She was a very cheerful, active young woman. Not really young, of course, only in comparison with Mrs. Wheeler she seemed so, and there was nothing in the least abject about her. Of course she kept herself well in the background when Mrs. Wheeler was present, but that is no more than one would expect. And there was no doubt that they were very fond of each other. They were indeed just like mother and daughter, or rather what mother and daughter ought to be like, but so often aren't, alas. The only person in the place who did not seem absolutely devoted to Miss Dalrymple, strangely enough, was the vicar himself. It was strange, because in many ways they had so much in common. At one time, indeed, I had hopes that the pair of them would make a match of it. It seemed so extremely suitable, and I know that I did my little best to bring it to pass. Certainly I've always felt that a bachelor vicar, however excellent, is out of place in a parish like ours, though I know that St. Paul thought otherwise. But it was not to be, and as the years went on it was impossible not to notice a certain coolness, I wouldn't go so far as to call it hostility, between him and Miss Dalrymple. Of course they always remained scrupulously polite and acted together quite harmoniously on committees and bazaars and at other parish functions. That was how matters stood when Mrs. Wheeler came to the village, and that was how they remained for a very long time. Nothing changes very much over years in a quiet place like this, except that we all grow a little older. And I think it was quite a shock to most of us to realize last year how very much older and more infirm dear Mrs. Wheeler had become. She went out less and less, and Miss Dalrymple too withdrew almost entirely from our little activities, owing to the necessity of having to look after her. Mrs. Wheeler had some objection to a nurse, so that all the burden fell upon poor Miss Dalrymple. It was really very hard upon her, though she never complained, and I must say that she was quite as good and careful as any professional nurse could be. A month or two ago, however, it became sadly evident that Mrs. Wheeler was seriously ill. Dr. Perry, who was always, I think, just the least bit afraid of her, plucked up the courage to insist that she should have a night nurse permanently on duty, and this gave Miss Dalrymple a little more freedom to come out and see her friends. One evening, shortly after the nurse had been installed, she came round to see me. I had expected her to be tired and anxious, but I was not prepared to find her quite so depressed and utterly unlike her usual cheerful self. Naturally, my first question was after Mrs. Wheeler. "She's very ill indeed. Dr. Perry thinks that it's most unlikely she'll recover." It's always difficult to know what to say on such occasions. I said, "Oh dear," which I'm afraid was rather inadequate, but I tried to put as much sympathy into my voice as possible. Miss Dalrymple said nothing for a moment or two, but sat there looking very low and miserable. Finally she said, "The trouble is, Miss Burnside, but she doesn't realise how ill she is. Surely that's all to the good. After all, if she's going to die, it is better that she should not be troubled with any forebodings about it. It isn't as if she were a Roman Catholic," I added, "and in need of making confession or anything of that kind. Not a dear good woman like Mrs. Wheeler could have anything to confess, of course." "It isn't that," she answered, looking more miserable than ever. "You see, Dr. Perry says that she might die at any minute, and I happen to know that she has not made any will." I confess that I could not help feeling a little shocked, disgusted even, that Miss Dalrymple should be thinking of such things at such a time. And I thought then, as I have thought so many times since, how mistaken one can be, even about somebody one has known for a long time. Of course, I knew, like everybody in the village, that Miss Dalrymple had absolutely nothing of her own, and I knew also, because Mrs. Wheeler had told me so, that her employer had intentions of making some provision for her after her death. I could quite understand Miss Dalrymple feeling disappointed at having to go out and look for another post at her age, but at the same time I could not think that it was rather improper to be thinking of such matters, much more discussing them, while the person in question is still alive. I must have shown something of my feelings in my expression, although I certainly did my best not to, for Miss Dalrymple immediately said, "Oh, please don't imagine that I'm thinking of myself, Miss Burnside." "Oh, naturally," I said, "of course not," for I wondered very much of whom else she could possibly be thinking. But what she said next surprised me very much indeed. "It would be a lamentable thing, and absolutely contrary to Mrs. Wheeler's own wishes, if all that money of hers were to go to her son." Now this was the very first time that I or anybody else, so far as I was aware, had ever so much as heard that Mrs. Wheeler had a son, and that only goes to show how very reticent she'd always been about her own affairs, and how very loyal a companion Miss Dalrymple had been, never once to have mentioned the fact to any of her friends in the village. "Her son, Miss Dalrymple? Whatever do you mean?" And then she told me all about him. It appeared that Mrs. Wheeler had a son who, as is, I am afraid, so often the case with the children of the most excellent religious people, had turned out very badly indeed. It crossed my mind that perhaps young Charles Wheeler, that was his name apparently, took after his father, but this was really very uncharitable of me, for of course I knew nothing whatever about the late Mr. Wheeler, except that he made a great deal of money, and that, after all, was nothing against his character, rather the reverse. At all events, as a result of his misconduct, and although Miss Dalrymple most properly entered into no details, I gathered that it had been very grave indeed. The young man had for many years entirely cut himself off from his family, and Miss Dalrymple did not so much as know where he was living, except that it was somewhere abroad. And the only communication that his mother had received from him recently was an application for money a little time before she was taken ill, which she had, of course, refused to consider in any way. And now there was a possibility of Mrs. Wheeler's money being diverted to this wicked person, to be turned by him to the most disreputable purposes. I could well understand Miss Dalrymple's agitation at such a thing, although I may as well admit that I did not wholly credit her assertion that she was not thinking at all of her own prospects, because, after all, we are all human. Speaking for myself, I felt particularly alarmed when I reflected that Mrs. Wheeler's property included the right of presentation to our living, and that this might well fall into the hands of an outright rascal. I was sadly perplexed in my mind as to what advice I should give Miss Dalrymple on this difficult question, for though I am always prepared to listen to other people's troubles, and my friends have told me that I am a particularly good listener, giving advice is a responsibility which I do not care to undertake. At last it occurred to me to suggest that she should consult the vicar, who from his position was particularly suited to bring Mrs. Wheeler to a sense of the danger which she was in, and who was himself really interested in the matter in another way. I mean, until this moment, everybody regarded him as Mrs. Wheeler's nearest relative, although presumably he was well aware of the existence of his ill-behaved cousin. I could see that Miss Dalrymple did not altogether like the prospect of confiding in the vicar, but she agreed to think it over, and a little later she went home, feeling, I am sure, all the better for having had a good chat. There is, I think, nothing better than a good chat with the right sort of person to make you look on the bright side of things. Next morning, as soon as I had breakfasted, I put on my hat and I went round to the hall to inquire. I had done this many times since Mrs. Wheeler had been taken ill, of course, but on this occasion, though I am not, I trust, superstitious, I did feel a certain sense of foreboding as I did so. And sure enough, as I came round the bend in the drive, I saw that the blinds of the house had been drawn, and I knew at once that our dear friend had passed away. I was about to turn round and go home again, when the front door opened and Miss Dalrymple came out. She saw me and came straight up towards me, so that, without feeling that I was in any way intruding, I was able to get the very first information about what had happened from her, instead of having to rely upon village gossip, which is always rather undignified, in my opinion, and has the added disadvantage that one does not know what to believe. Dear Mrs. Wheeler, she told me, had taken a sudden turn for the worse at about 2 o'clock that morning. Dr. Perry had been sent for immediately, of course, but he was out attending a maternity case, and in spite of all that Miss Dalrymple and the nurse could do, by the time that he arrived, which was not until nearly 7, all was over. The doctor had said that he could have done nothing had he been there in time, and I was glad to learn that the end had been altogether peaceful. I dare say that I should not have been thinking of such things at such a moment, but remembering our conversation of the evening before, I could not forbear saying, "Then I suppose poor Mrs. Wheeler was never able to make a will after all." Then Miss Dalrymple told me her great news. It seemed that after the first seizure, Mrs. Wheeler had rallied and remained quite conscious and sensible for several hours, and during that time, knowing that her last hour had come, she had been able to make her will. By that will, Miss Dalrymple told me, she had bequeathed £1,000 to her nephew the vicar, and the whole of the rest of her fortune to Miss Dalrymple herself. I could hardly believe my ears. It really seemed too good to be true, and I congratulated her most warmly, but, I hope, with the solemnity that the occasion required. Still, I found it difficult to credit that the story should have had so happy an ending. "Forgive me for asking you," I said, "but are you quite sure that this is really so? Have you seen the will yourself?" "Indeed I have," she told me. "We sent for the vicar, of course, as soon as we saw how gravely ill she was. The moment she recovered consciousness, she told him to write down what she wished. I saw her sign the paper, and then the vicar and I put our names underneath hers as witnesses." When I had got this far in telling the story to my nephew John, he made a most peculiar noise, something between a snort and a laugh. Of course, with his knowledge he saw at once what was wrong, but we are not all lawyers, thank goodness, and neither Miss Dalrymple nor I had the least idea at the time that the will was anything but perfectly legal. Nor, I am sure, had poor Mrs. Wheeler, unless the knowledge was vouchsafed to her in heaven, in which case it must have made her very unhappy, if such a thing is possible in heaven. But it is a fact, cruel and unfair though it may seem, that the law does not allow a will to be legal unless it is witnessed by 2 persons, and that neither of those 2 persons is allowed to have any benefit from the will which they have witnessed. So that, as John put it, the only 2 people in the world who could not receive any of Mrs. Wheeler's money under her will were the vicar and Miss Dalrymple, the only 2 people whom she desired to give anything to. I said then, and I still think, that it is most unreasonable, and a kind of trap for innocent people like companions and country clergy who could not be expected to know anything about the law, because, after all, who could be better suited to witness an old lady's will than her nephew and the woman who had looked after her for so many years? I think they should have thought of such things when the law was made, but I suppose it is too late to alter it now. Of course, neither Miss Dalrymple nor I knew anything of this at the time, but we were speedily undeceived. The day after the funeral she came to see me in great distress, and told me that she had been to consult a lawyer as to what was to be done about Mrs. Wheeler's estate. And he had told her that by witnessing the will she and the vicar had signed away all their inheritance. She told me also that the vicar had called upon her and expressed his sorrow that his ignorance had led to her losing the reward of her long years of service, not to mention his own £1,000, which he admitted was a serious matter for him, for the living was not a good one. After that, Miss Dalrymple left the village. I understand she secured another post to the lady at Cheltenham, where she was not well paid, and where, I am afraid, she was anything but happy. Meanwhile, we in the village awaited the dreadful moment when Mr. Charles Wheeler would descend upon us to take possession of the property which had, in this strange way, become his after all. A week or more went by, and then we heard the great and unexpected news. I had it first from Mrs. Tomlin at the post-office, and although I always suspect anything from that source, it was soon afterwards confirmed by the vicar himself. It appeared that as soon as it was established that the will was of no effect, the vicar made inquiries for the whereabouts of the son, and these inquiries had met with a speedy and most unhoped result. Charles Wheeler was no more. He had perished, very miserably, I am sorry to say, in some foreign town, quite soon after his last letter to his mother asking for assistance. The vicar had been shown that letter at the time, and he told me that in it he had stated that he was dangerously ill. It was the vicar who had counselled Mrs. Wheeler not to reply to it, thinking that the statement of his condition was only a ruse to get more money from the mother who had cast him off. And he said, very generously as I thought at the time, that he now regretted that he had not allowed his aunt to take measures which might have prolonged the unfortunate man's life a little longer. But I told him that although the sentiment did him credit, it was much better as it was, and I remember that I went so far as to say that the death of Charles Wheeler might be accounted a providential event. So, after all, the vicar, as the only living relative of his aunt, came into all her possessions, and we were all so pleased at this happy turn of events that I am afraid we had little thought to spare for poor Miss Dalrymple, who after all was the person whom Mrs. Wheeler had mainly had in mind. And the vicar was so popular in the village, except, of course, with old Judd and people of his stamp, that there was no one who did not rejoice in his good fortune. Indeed, and this is my great difficulty at the present moment, he is still just as popular as ever, simply because nobody, myself only excepted, knows the truth. Just over a week ago I spent a night in London with my brother and sister-in-law, a thing I do very rarely, except when the summer sales are in progress. They took me to the theatre that evening, I remember. It was a most amusing piece, but I do not recollect the name, and invited to join the party of a Mr. Woodhouse, whom I had never met before. And during the interval between the acts, he asked me where I lived, and when I told him, said, "And I suppose you know Mr. and mentioned the vicar by name. "Indeed I do," I told him, and was about to go on to tell him something of the strange story of Mrs. Wheeler's will, when he interrupted me. "I was up with him at Oxford. A very clever fellow, I thought him." "He is a very good man," I answered with some emphasis, "and I think that is more important. One does not somehow like to hear one's vicar described as a very clever fellow, even if it is kindly meant." "Oh, but he's clever too," Mr. Woodhouse persisted. "I remember he took a first-class honours degree in law the year I graduated." I was thunderstruck. "In law, Mr. Woodhouse? Are you sure that you are not mistaken?" "Oh, quite sure. He was intended for the bar, you know, but he changed his mind and went into the church instead. Rather a waste of a good intellect, I thought." Luckily the curtain rose for the next act before I could ask him what he meant by his last, very improper observation, and I took good care not to refer to the subject again. All the way down in the train next day I could think of nothing but what Mr. Woodhouse had told me. If the vicar had really studied law at Oxford, how was it possible that he made such a mistake as he had done about witnessing the will? I tried to comfort myself by reflecting that he might have forgotten this particular point, but it seemed hardly possible, and indeed John has told me since that it is one of the first principles of the law of wills, though why they should make a first principle of anything so unjust and cruel I do not in the least understand. But if he knew that by becoming a witness Miss Dalrymple was losing her right to Mrs. Wheeler's property, however hostile to her he may have felt, why had he been content to destroy his own chances of getting £1,000 also? It was all most puzzling and mysterious, and I made up my mind, come what might, to speak to him at the first opportunity. And that opportunity came last Sunday, after matins. I still blush when I think of it. Not for myself, for I feel that I only obeyed my conscience in saying what I did, but for him. His effrontery was so astonishing. I can recall, I do not think I shall ever forget, exactly what passed between us. I met him, as I said, just as he was coming out of the vestry door after the service. He said good morning to me, and I responded as politely as I could. Then I said, I met an old acquaintance of yours in London, Vicar, a Mr. Woodhouse. Oh, yes, Woodhouse. I haven't seen him for a very long time. I resolved not to beat about the bush. He told me that you had studied the law at Oxford, and were awarded first-class honours for your proficiency. He did not show the least confusion, but merely said, It is pleasant to have one's little triumphs remembered. Then did you not know, I pressed him, that Miss Dalrymple ought not to have witnessed that will? Ought not, Miss Burnside? I should prefer to say that Mrs. Wheeler ought not to have tried to dispose of her property in the way that she did. I could hardly speak for indignation. Then you deliberately so arranged matters that Miss Dalrymple should lose what Mrs. Wheeler wished her to have? I did. Even at the cost of losing your own legacy? But you see, I have not lost it, he answered with a smile, and then I suddenly saw the light. Vicar, you knew all the time that Charles Wheeler was dead. He nodded. I had a telegram from a British consul informing me of his death some months ago. In view of my aunt's state of health, I thought it wiser to keep the news from her. Do you blame me? I was so angry that I'm afraid I lost all respect for his cloth. Blame you? I think you have behaved like a common thief. And then he used those awful words that I have already mentioned. Well, Miss Burnside, and what are you going to do about it? What, indeed? Tomorrow it is Sunday again. I know that my absence from church would cause the most undesirable talk in the place. But yet I feel as if, so long as he is vicar, dear St. Ethelreda's can never be the same place for me again. The hall is up for sale, and I hear dreadful rumours that it is to be bought by a builder. All our pleasant life in this village is at an end, so far as I am concerned. I wish somebody would answer that question for me. What am I going to do? That was Miss Burnside's Dilemma by Cyril Hare, read by Matthew Jones. For discerning listeners, a wider range of stories is available on our website. Should you wish to become a member, please see www.mjam-from-london.webnode.co.uk for details. Thank you for listening.